Today, I have Michael Garff, the Chief Operating Officer for IONIQ, which is a groundbreaking cancer detection technology in the biotech space, I guess. Is that the right way to put it? Mike, you tell me, please.
Yeah, you got it. That's right.
Excellent. Okay, very good. And obviously, if you're watching this or listening to this, you're used to hearing me, Scotty John, talk about the information technology space. Today, we're doing a little bit of a departure from that and exploring the biotechnology space with Mike here. I certainly am looking forward to this conversation. I'm excited. I know I'll learn a lot, a little outside my wheelhouse, but I'm looking forward to learning. And again, for those of you who are watching or listening, I hope you feel the same way. So, Mike, let's just jump right into it, man. What would you say inspired a career in the biotech industry?
Well, so my start begins with MBA school, and I was very kind of finance focused, all about the numbers. And when I started MBA school, my wife and some advisors said, "Hey, you should check out the Lassonde New Venture Development Center. It's really cool." And so I got involved in that, and that was my introduction to technology. What the Lassonde Center does is it combines science, professors and students with the business people. And it kind of happened by mistake. Pierre Lassonde was a billionaire in mining. He wanted to give back to the university and promote business. He graduated in business, his wife graduated in science. And so he's like, let's do a center that serves both. But the genius behind it was that when you combine business with science, then you can have progress. And so, first year I worked on something called carbon sequestration, which is taking CO2 emissions from coal-fired plants and injecting them underneath the surface, storing them in saline aquifers. Very cool technology. And then I was invited to become the student director. And so at that point, we went through the most promising patents that were in the university tech transfer office, handpicked the best 15, created companies and teams of scientists with business people to launch companies. So that was my introduction to technology. And then from there, I transitioned into this biotech company that focuses on early cancer detection.
Your focus was on business. Um, and, I agree with you wholeheartedly that business and the intersection between business and science is how we get to progress. I think that was very well put. But you said you got involved. Was that by happenstance? I mean, was that based on interest? How exactly did that happen?
Well, the Lassonde Center was new, and so there were probably about 20 spots available for master's students that were interested. So it was just a matter of applying and being accepted. But to know about the center, that was through my wife and also through people in the business school that knew what was happening at the university.
Very cool. It's funny how those little moments that will kind of change the whole trajectory of your career, right?
Yeah, and it like I was all about business, finance, and no one seeks like I'm going to be a biotech business person. They kind of end up there by mistake, but it's a really good industry. It does good for people, and it can be very lucrative if you can get past all the regulation and all those hurdles. But it's a great place to be. So glad I did it.
Yeah, indeed. And to your point, so as the chief operating officer today at IONIQ, I know you're obviously very familiar with the hurdles of regulation. And again, it's really cool what you guys are doing. So hopefully you can get through those hurdles and we see that go to market here at some point in the future. Moving on to, unless you've got a comment about that, please.
No, go ahead.
Okay. So moving on, and I suspect that perhaps we'll talk about this a little bit more, Ionic specifically with this question, but can you talk a little bit about some of the, what you consider the most significant achievements in your career thus far?
Sure. So at IONIQ Sciences, we started just as a small company on a dining room table. And so I've been able to grow that business from that point, create the product, develop the product, set up manufacturing, Over the years, we've raised $40 million. We've completed 7 clinical studies, acquired 17 patents. I was super instrumental in getting European regulatory approval, setting up quality systems, and doing a European launch. And so it's just been a big journey from starting really small to going after a big problem, which is cancer detection, and building a business and a viable product. We started in lung cancer, but eventually we were able to show feasibility in all cancers. And so that's been my most significant achievements in the biotech. At the same time, my wife and I are involved in real estate. We own a real estate brokerage. And I would just touch on that briefly because although that's been a side hustle, we've been able to acquire wealth in real estate. And the way we've done that, some people are trust fund people and they inherit a ton of money. We did not, but we've been able to buy rentals and take that money out through refinances and repeat it over and over and over again. And we own single family duplexes. We've recently entered into the vacation rental market in Park City and Bear Lake. And building wealth through real estate is also a secondary passion of mine that we've had success with. And the returns can be quite amazing. Just to give you a quick example, if you were to buy a house for $500,000 and you go in with a 20% down payment, the real estate market generally returns here in Utah about 8% per year. So you're not making 8% on your money. You're making, essentially, you got to times it by 5. You're making 40% return on your money. Okay. Now, that's already sounds good, but once you hold that house and then refinance in 2 years and do it again, now you're making 80% return on your money. You get your third house, you're making 120% return on your money. And so those returns seem like astronomically good and almost fake, but you can do it. And we were able to do that together as a team, as a side hustle, and build wealth in real estate, which is something I think is significant and a great achievement and something that anyone else could do too. You just have to have the discipline and do it.
Yeah, one of the wonders of the world, right? Compounding interest and helps. I'm sure you get plenty of numbers in as a COO, but probably helps you with your fix to go back to those roots as a numbers guy, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Awesome, very cool. Well, that's super interesting, and quite frankly, something that I personally have an interest in and some experience. That doesn't sound like quite as much as you. We'll have to save that conversation for another day. But no, I appreciate that. I guess just if are there any corollaries you could draw and benefits that you gained from that quote unquote side hustle that have helped you in your day job?
Um, I guess what I would say is it's all about taking calculated bets and looking at risk the right way. There's a quote that I share often, and that is, true confidence is not merely expecting the best outcome, but is knowing how you're going to handle the worst. And so you got to have a plan on how crap hits the fan. So many people are fearful to do certain tech projects or maybe to invest in real estate. They're like, oh, well, what if this happens? What if that happens? But if you've got a plan, then you can make that asymmetric bet and do very well. And I think that discipline applies as a biotech executive, and it applies just in life in general. I think it's actually a religious principle for having faith in something. And so that's how I would see how they relate.
Very cool. Very cool. Again, sounds like maybe more conversations after this one. But I do want to focus a little bit more on the biotech space. And I also want to focus on the fact that you have, again, in your I tried using air quotes earlier, so I need to actually say air quotes moving forward for those that are listening versus watching this on YouTube. Um, but for your quote unquote day job, I'm curious. Obviously, getting into that C-suite, um, that's a coveted place to be. Sounds like you kind of grew into that at Ionic, but I'm wondering what strategies you recommend for networking specific, and this is coming from a recruiter, right? So networking is near and dear, though the word drives me nuts. The concept's near and dear to my heart. How did it help in your career, if at all? I'm genuinely curious, given kind of your trajectory at this one company.
Well, so networking's key, and I think you have to be open. It's not like your life is written and you know exactly where you're going to end up, and so as far as networking, this is nothing new, but it's been said that like it's not what your network provides to you, but the value that you can offer to your network. So always find ways to offer value to others, and then it pays off, and try to meet as many as people and try to find the good in people. Some people are difficult or jerks or whatever, but there's always something you can learn from them and develop. So I think you just got to be open.
Yeah, I appreciate that. To your point, it maybe it's been said before, the aspect of you know what you can do for others, but I do think it's worth reiterating the openness that you have to have, and you know being able to kind of let yourself go in a direction you might not have expected to go, based on some of the individuals that you meet along the way. So, what about mentorship? It's similar, right? I think, goes kind of hand in hand in many ways with networking, but have mentors played a role in your career thus far? And if so, do you have any recommendations for the best way to find mentors?
Recently, LinkedIn, I'm not sure if you'll find a mentor. You'll probably find someone that's just as hungry as you are that can be a friend, but that's still a benefit. So mentors have really got to, I think they tend to be people older in life. And so it's kind of like figure out people like your parents' age and their friends and network that way. I think that's the most effective. But I've had mentors throughout the years, whether it's a boss or someone. And one mentor taught me that, you got to swing for the fences, go for big opportunities, but make sure that when you fail, that you fail small. I've always remembered that because in tech, we do big projects, we go after big ideas. You can't afford a huge failure. You've got to set it up in ways where you have small failures. And so I think that's helped me a lot in my career. And then just going along with like bosses, like some bosses are great and you learn a ton. And then other bosses are maybe harder. And I've noticed that you can still learn from them on how to maybe be firm. The place where I would draw the line is like when you just rule with fear and you're mean, it's effective in the short term, but then in the long term, you lose loyalty of your employees. So as I've kind of said before, I think mentors can often be people that are maybe in a position of power, but maybe you don't fully agree with how they manage and stuff, but there's still things you can learn. And I have in my career.
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting point. Taking the individuals you report to in your career, because we all do, no matter what. Um, and even if you don't necessarily agree with everything, finding the nuggets, right, that you can take away and build upon for as you continue to grow as a professional. That's super interesting. Well, you mentioned asymmetrical bets, and you've mentioned, or asymmetrical risk, I should say, and you've mentioned um, you know trying to take bigger risks but fail small. Are there this is tough because I think we really get into the weeds potentially here, but
Sure.
are there any guidelines or best practices around how to do that?
I'll give kind of two examples or two thoughts, right? So the first is, in the tech world, it's all about the budgets, right? So how can I how can I get as far as possible with the smallest amount of money? And like in my world in cancer detection, it's, rather than me spending a bunch of money on a huge study to see if the device works for breast cancer, let's just look at like 5 patients and look at the feasibility and see if it works. And maybe on like the prostate cancer patients, it didn't work. On the breast cancer patients, it did work. Oh, I failed small because I just took a bite size. But now on the breast cancer, now I can go to phase 2 and expand from there. So that would be kind of the approach I would take. The second approach that I would share is if there's like a mega trend, this has to do with like asymmetric bets. There's like a mega trend happening. You may actually not like the outcome of the trend. It's like, think of it like, I don't know, it could be political. Democrats are in control, the Republicans are in control. It doesn't matter who's in control. If you are confident in the outcome, you can place the bet on that outcome. And so the analogy is like, I think of a quarter. Don't pick heads or tails, just be on the edge of the quarter. You know which way it's going to fall and be prepared to benefit from that, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah. Again, probably could go down a whole rabbit hole on just this one topic, but we'll save that for another day. So, with regard to your the space you occupy as a COO, I'm curious how you balance, and frankly don't know how technical you really are when it comes to um, kind of the front line of biotechnology and your product. But how do you balance your technical expertise with the business acumen in your role insofar as you need to?
Okay. So, I mean, and the truthfulness is I didn't start technical. I started just purely business minded. But after 15 years of working on a specific technology, you get very technical.
Sure.
And the balance that I would suggest is yes, you've got to learn the business. So you got to know enough to get technical. But as you grow, you should hire people that are smarter than you that can do the technical stuff. You just have to understand enough to be dangerous so that you can manage the process and help make decisions. But you don't have to be like the whiz kid on the spreadsheets and all the science and the data. But you do need to know enough to manage it. And so as you grow, I think the skills, the business skills, at the beginning, maybe the technical part's most important, but then as you grow, the business skills of managing and communication become more important over time.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to continue to go back to your quote, and I'm going to attribute this quote to you moving forward, Mike. But progress comes at the intersection of technology and business. To me, that's one of the best ways I've ever heard it put, and I absolutely agree. So that that tracks very well. Okay, some of the things that you and I had planned to talk about, we've already kind of covered. So I'm gonna move on. I think this is a great segue too, because you just mentioned, you know, at some point you will have to hire, and you're always going to want to hire those smarter than you, especially as it relates to the technical aspect of your business or an information technology business, right?
Mhm.
So I recognize that, oftentimes this is going to depend on the role, but in general, are there qualities or skills that you prioritize when you're looking to hire into your team?
Okay. So the analogy I'd say here is, the people can talk the talk, but can they walk the walk, right? And so I think it's important that they can talk the talk because they need to be able to present with authority, with persuasion to whether it's investors or people within the company. And that you can really get a sense of during the interview. You just talk to them and see if they're confident when they talk and if they're good at that. But then it's like, okay, can they walk the walk? Is this all smoke and mirrors? And what I
Mm.
do in the interviews, I always ask for writing samples. I ask for a technical writing sample and a visual. I want to see, can they put together a slide deck that's visually appealing? aesthetically appealing, that is persuasive. And then on the technical side, we do a lot of regulatory writing. We write papers, or it could be whether it's software programming or coding. You've got to see that, and that shows their output. Make sure that they are like the sole contributor or the major contributor to that piece. I have them send it to me, and then I follow up with them and say, hey, walk me through this. Like, what did you do here? What does this mean? Because maybe it's so technical, it might be above my head in certain ways. But that's how I flesh out a good candidate.
So just to make sure I'm clear, and I think again for the benefit of those that may be watching or listening right now, um, this is throughout the process, correct? So you're actually asking them to put together some work product to then send back to you. It's not in real time in the interview. Is that right?
Yeah, it's so the first interview is just talking, and then after the interview, if I like what I see, I say, hey, please send me some writing samples, both a technical piece and a visual piece, and then that will tee up the second interview.
Sure. No, that makes sense. Um, okay, yeah, no, I love that. And I think that, to your point, um, it's about validating to the best of your ability in an interview process, whether or not someone can or has done the job before. Right. So that's what we're all trying to do. Um,
And they
yeah.
say it's like a coin toss. I don't know, you're the expert. Like statistically, like what is it, like 50 or 60% chance that you're going to be right? So you got to do whatever you can, because those are not good odds, right?
Yeah, and I do know a little bit about this. And what I'll say, my favorite analogy is the amount of data, the amount of testing, interviews, like psychological batteries that these individuals go through. Um, there's so much that goes into the NFL draft, right? The combine and all the stats that somebody has from a collegiate career. And yet, first round picks, it's to your point, it's about 50% boom or bust. So
Right.
it
You
it
just got to.
doesn't it does not it doesn't necessarily inspire confidence for those of us that are in a position of having to hire. But to your point, you do the best you can. And I absolutely think that, you've got to do that because if you didn't do that, if you truly just flipped a coin, you'd have a way worse odds. But yeah, it's tough. So um interesting. All right, well, cool. So like I said, I think we've covered some of these other things, but I'm curious. So I had a boss who around our office at least was famously said, hey, we're not curing cancer here. You guys actually are, right? I'd argue that early detection is the best possible cure we have for cancer today. So I'm curious, knowing that, and knowing how important it is to get things right, how do you foster innovation and experimentation at your company?
Sure.
If
So we are going after a big animal, early cancer detection, and I do have to agree with you. That is the best way to treat cancer. If you detect it early, you've got so many tools. Your survival rate goes up from 20% up to 80 to 90%. So in our company, we have people of various tiers in the company. We have a weekly science meeting where people present their research, their data, and that's just a big open collaboration where people can share ideas and people can provide pointers, regardless if you're high or low in the organization. Say, oh, try this approach, or do this differently. The second thing that we did, which was more fun, is we did something called Journal Club. And what Journal Club is someone comes with a journal article that they read, or it could even be a website of a competing technology or some approach, and says, hey, this is something that's happening. And as a company, we can maybe do this the same way or maybe do it differently. And here's a way we can up our game. And so we did that on a bi-weekly basis where people would come prepared with journal articles or website reviews, and they would share what they've learned, present it formally, and then we could see how we could maybe weave something of that into our overall corporate strategy.
Very cool. And when that happened, were they typically journal articles specifically in your space, or did you encourage people to look outside of the space as well? Because sometimes, you get inspiration from other areas of science. Is that like, how
Yes.
did you guys do it?
So yes to both. So we have a niche because we're bioimpedance for cancer detection, and so we would pull journal articles that focus on that specifically. But at the same time, like competitors that use blood tests for cancer, as an example, we would look at someone would pull their scientific presentations and say, "Hey, look, this is how they're presenting their results." They have these studies that are not large in sample size, yet they're presenting it very effectively. Oh, why don't we take some of those things and incorporate that into our presentations, as an example?
That's super cool. And it strikes me like the level of complexity at of your business, because I think you mentioned earlier how important persuasiveness is. Being able to tell a story is so important. You could have the best technology ever, but if you can't effectively communicate why that is, and what, how that's going to go to market and ultimately return value for investors, I mean, it doesn't matter, right? So that's really interesting. Cool. Okay. All right. So you're in the C-suite. So this is great for me because I get asked this question from your perspective. What would you say are the attributes that are essential for a technology executive? So let's call it a director and above, to be successful in the eyes of the C-suite.
Okay. And we've touched on some of these things already, but the first is like you got to have enough knowledge to manage the business, whether that's scientific or whatever. So, I mean, being willing to get your hands dirty is always important. We talked about hiring people that are smarter than you, maybe more technical underneath. And so, really, once you hit that C-suite level, you actually communication becomes so important. And that's hard for me because I don't want to practice like looking in a mirror and communicating. Like I just want to get the job done.
Yeah,
And
sure.
so, but if you don't communicate your message effectively, like to members of the board or to the CEO or whoever, nothing's going to happen, or to investors or maybe like partners or customers. So communication just becomes super key. You got to be able to manage people. Project management is super important, but those would be the skills that I would highlight.
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah, I'm sure we could talk all day about that particular question, but in the interest of time, this is a question I'm fascinated to ask you, because again, I spend most of my time learning about and focusing on information technology, and as you can tell, I've got a cursory level knowledge of biotech. So I'm curious, from somebody who's in it and has been for the last 15 years, what technological advancements and trends do you anticipate will shape the biotechnology industry in the coming years?
Yeah. And so we can already see some of it happening now. Medicine will shift from the clinic to the home. And you've got like the Apple claim, like, oh, we predicted people were going to have a heart attack and we saved lives. And so I do think just owning data, analyzing data is going to be huge. AI is going to be a big factor. The FDA finally has guidance on how to manage an AI driven algorithm. And I thought they would never get there
Hmm.
because they are so like old school. Like you have a algorithm, you lock it down, and then you perform a study and you validate it. How are you going to validate something that's constantly changing and learning? I mean, it's crazy, but I think wearables will be big. Anything big data that collects information. We now know that like computer AI algorithms are more accurate than radiologists when looking at an image. And so there's going to be a lot of advancements in those fields.
And again, I had no preconceived notions necessarily going into that question, but again, for the audience that we have here at Kista IT, and those that are likely listening to this conversation, everything you just talked about effectively, it seems like the intersection of information technology and biotechnology, which is pretty exciting. I would guess, for IT professionals that are interested in this space. Um, okay, so on that note, are there resources? Books are hard, right? Because there's some evergreen books, but especially talking about your space, I imagine journal articles, things that are not necessarily taking 2 years to get produced and put out into the world. Any resources you recommend on keeping up to date on these trends, with regard to biotech, or for that matter, since you seem to have some good ideas around it with regard to information technology.
Sure. So books are tough, right? Because they're written and they're frozen, and so that's hard. But you know what is super effective? I think now are podcasts, and no
Mm,
matter what field you're interested in, there is a podcast out there with smart people on there talking about it. And so I would encourage your listeners just to find podcasts that you're interested in. And really, it's almost like you're having a one-way conversation. You can't talk back to them, but you hear them talking to you, you can absorb a ton. And it's funny too. Like my friend is a trail runner, and I said, "Well, what podcast do you listen to while you're trail running?" He's like, "I listen to trail running podcasts while I'm trail running." So he's like hyper focused on
yeah.
one thing. I like to be doing something active in the mountains or whatever, and then I'll get something that's intellectually stimulating in tech or business or whatever, and I'll put that in and I'll listen. And I think that's the best way to stay up to date. You do have to be careful about confirmation bias.
Yeah.
And I've learned this as I've like invested in crypto or whatever, is if you think it's a good idea and you try to find other people that think it's a good idea, all of a sudden it's an amazing idea and there nothing can go wrong. So be careful confirmation bias and try to be open to seeing both, opinions, but podcasts I think are super effective.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a podcast junkie, and as you well know, this conversation we're having, it'll be released on YouTube. It'll also be released in podcast form. I'm not. I'm not even. There's no temptation to compare myself to some of the podcasters that I listen to, by any means. But I am curious. I've got some thoughts around this. And I'm also trying to avoid my confirmation bias here, Mike. But any particular podcasts or podcast hosts that you recommend in this space?
um, you know, I'm very kind of entrepreneurial mindset. So I'm listening to like how I built this. If it's real estate, there's one called Bigger Pockets that deals with investing. I'd say, you know, biotech is a little more difficult.
Sure.
And perhaps it's maybe not like a show, but it's a certain TED talk or whatever, or something specific. But I'd say for like technology, the TED talks are actually really good too.
Yeah. Yeah. The TED podcast, right? Because it's varied, different different topics, and you can kind of cherry pick. Um, I think Andrew Huberman's an interesting podcaster. He's definitely a very smart guy, Stanford professor, but he's taking complex medical topics and trying to democratize them, so to speak, make it
Mhm.
a layperson like myself able to kind of digest them. So that's one I certainly think is interesting, and has some corollary to the biotechnology space. Again, I'm a bit of a junkie. I'll resist the temptation to list off a bunch here, but that's great.
Send me
Uh,
your list. I want to know after. Just send
yeah,
me.
for sure. I will share it.
Okay.
And I'll say too that, just on the point of confirmation bias, one thing that I've tried to make a best practice is seeking out people I disagree with. It's funny you
Yeah.
mentioned crypto. I listen to a podcast regularly that pretty much is anti-crypto, specifically to hear like what are these arguments and are they
Yeah.
ever going to be compelling enough for
Are they
me?
valid? Yeah.
Yeah, to kind of rethink my strong opinions loosely held, right? So, um, very cool. Okay, just a handful more questions here, Mike, and I'll get you out of here. So, um, I don't know, maybe there are books on this topic, but maybe it's just advice for all those aspiring leaders, people that want to be in your seat someday. What guidance would you offer for them to advance in their career?
Are you asking for books or just general advice?
If you, I think both. Like, if there are books that you think are worthwhile that are kind of evergreen, then
Yeah.
sure, share that. But if it's more like you've taken the books you've read over the years and synthesized, like here's the advice I would offer. It's hard to be, succinct when we're talking about this, but I'm still
Sure.
going to ask you to try.
Well, let me comment on a few books. So I'll start
Okay.
with a fiction book. It's called The Power of One. And it's super cool because it's about a boxer and it takes place in South Africa with all the kind of the racism issues they had there. But the cool thing about it is several over and over in the book is they show how one person can make the difference in somebody's life and completely change their trajectory. Right. And so we've talked about mentors and we've talked about advice. And I think you've just got to like be open. And we talk about being open, like be open for that one person to make a huge difference in your life, change your trajectory for the better. As far as technology, there's a book that came out in 2020 called The Price of Tomorrow. And if you would have read that book in 2020 and then invested in all the technologies he was talking about, you would have made a killing. Like talks about like electrical cars and AI and inflation and deflation. And the part I loved about the book was just that he said basically everyone's worried that AI and technology is going to take away our jobs, but really technology is deflationary, so it's going to make things cheaper. And so we may even have a period where people don't have to work and maybe we can focus on the arts or we can focus on changing the world, solving cancer. I mean, who knows? So I enjoyed that one. And then the last one, just to go back to kind of the investing real estate side, is one called Rich Dad, Poor Dad. It's all about owning assets that produce income for you passively, whether it's in tech or real estate or whatever. I think that's super important.
Yeah, very good. Robert Kiyosaki, right? I think
Yep.
that one's evergreen for sure. Um, well, cool. I appreciate it. I think, I would think that on pretty much every metric that people think of when they think of success, you've been fortunate enough to experience it. Having said that, any advice you would share with the 25 or 22-year-old version of yourself, or for that matter, even 15-year-old version, I think we're going to see people launching careers younger and younger as a trend. But yeah, any advice to your younger self?
So this is funny, right? I mean, you think about the advice you give to your younger self, and you're like, well, what would the future self give to me now? And the funny thing is, I think the answer is the same.
I love it.
So my answer is two part. One is put yourself out there, right? I mean, go for it. It's okay to feel fear. It's natural. It's part of being alive. That fight or flight feeling that you get before a race or an event, that's great. If you're feeling that in business, like that's awesome. And you need to put yourself out there and not be afraid or fearful. And the second thing is make relationships. Like, I look on my past and I was so driven in school, like I'm going to get the job done. I'm going to get my degree. I'm going to work. I'm working a job. I got my family. I just put my head down. But then in the past, I look back and the few relationships I created with maybe my fellow students or with whoever, they're so valuable today in business. And so those would be the two things, right? Put yourself out there and make the relationships, and then I think you'll be set up to do well.
Awesome. Appreciate that. Anything there's a million things we could talk about, Mike, and it's obvious that we have some shared interests and perhaps have to avoid some confirmation bias in future conversations. But
Okay.
anything we didn't cover that you think's important that you'd like to get out there before we wrap today?
No, this has been an effective discussion. Thank you for allowing me to come, and yeah, happy to help any way I can. I appreciate your good questions.
Yeah, well, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much for coming on, and thank you all to those of you that are listening. Appreciate you tuning in and listening to the conversation. We'll see you soon.
Okay.